Evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for this webinar entitled The Sargent Shriver Effect, Spirit, Politics, and Peace Building. My name is James Kenley. I serve as the Executive Director of the Vail Symposium. And on behalf of our board chairman, Dale Mosier, and the entire Vail Symposium board, welcome. The Vail Symposium has been offering affordable, thought-provoking programming to the Vail community and now beyond since 1971. We are a nonprofit organization and ticket sales cover less than 15% of our operating revenue. Donors at every level bring our mission to life in our community and make programs like this one possible. I'd like to thank a few important organizations and individuals. Our presenting sponsors are the Town of Vail and the Frechette Family Foundation. Our event sponsors are Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Vail Daily, and the Antlers at Vail. Tonight's program is underwritten by Gary Gilman, and our virtual programs are sponsored by Alpine Bank. I will pause for your applause there at home. Two items to be aware of before we get started. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. You can type them at any time, and we'll get to as many as we can later in the program. We will run until about 7 p.m. Mountain, and this program is being recorded. Okay, our winter season is wrapping up here with gusto. The snow keeps falling in Vail, and we have more thought-provoking programming for you. On Thursday, March 16th, we will address one of the most pressing issues in our community today, housing. In 2017, the Vail Symposium presented a multi-day workshop called the NIMBY Jamboree, focused on workforce housing here in Eagle County. This time, Chris Romer from the Vail Valley Partnership will moderate a discussion with George Ruther, who's the Director of Housing for the Town of Vail, Lori Best from Breckenridge, and Tucker Holland from Nantucket Island for an event we're calling YIMBY Jamboree, Local Housing Solutions in Vail and Eagle County. That's this Thursday. And then next week on Wednesday, March 22nd, Clay Jenkinson, a historian and humanities scholar, returns to the Vail Symposium to present another conversation on controversial issues, this time about culture wars in higher education. And this discussion will feature a professor of politics at Princeton and a senior fellow at the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. The complete listing of our programs, as well as recordings from many of our past programs, and of course, our online donation page are all at vailsymposium.org. Tonight, we will discuss the Sargent Shriver effect, spirit, politics, and peace building. Sargent Shriver founded the Peace Corps under President Kennedy, architected the war on poverty under President Johnson, and served as the U.S. ambassador to France. His approach to serving people, designing public policy, and transforming conflict situations makes it possible to imagine a constructive way forward, a path that integrates the spiritual values of compassion and service into the secular structures of public affairs. With us tonight is Jamie Price. He's the founding director of the Sargent Shriver Peace Institute and author of The Call, the spiritual realism of Sargent Shriver, that draws on 20 years working by his side. Jamie is a research professor and the founding director of the Insight Conflict Resolution Program in the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University, and serves on the board of the Sargent Shriver National Center on Poverty Law. He also writes articles and essays for a wide range of scholarly and popular publications. Jamie holds a PhD from the Divinity School of the University of Chicago. Joining Jamie in conversation this evening is Michael Fosburg. He has been a performer, presenter, and a coach on diversity, equity, and inclusion for over 20 years, utilizing his award-winning autobiographical story told in the form of a one-man play as an entry point for meaningful dialogues on race and identity. Fosburg has been a frequent guest in the media and in corporate boardrooms, speaking on these issues, and his latest book, Nobody wants to talk about it. Race, identity, and the difficulties of forging meaningful conversations offers readers 7 important tools to engage in authentic dialogue. In 2011, he published his much lauded memoir, Incognito, An American Odyssey of Race and Self-Discovery. This evening, he'll guide us through spiritual, philosophic, and pragmatic terrain through Sargent Shriver's inspiring work. And now it is my pleasure to welcome to the Vail Symposium, Jamie Price and Michael Fosburg.
Thank you, James. And hello, Jamie. Let's bring about some peace this evening, shall we?
Sounds great. Nice to see you, Michael. And James, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Yes, indeed. I want to give attendees an opportunity to sort of figure out like how we got here. Because how you and I came together, Jamie, is through your previous book, which was Spiritualizing Politics Without Politicizing Religion. And I had a conversation with you on my podcast, Incognito, the podcast, and we went into depth about that book. And so I want to know, before we sort of get to the crux of the new work, which is called The Call, what led you from spiritualizing politics without politicizing religion to The Call?
That's a very interesting question. There's a common theme, of course. They're both books about Sargent Shriver, and they both have the notion of spirit in the title. But I think what led me to them, what led me from one to the other, was the first one. I'm distracted by, I'm in New York City and I'm distracted by a siren outside my window, so I apologize for that. But the first one was done in broad strokes rather than fine lines. The Call's in rather finer lines. The first one's focused on the problem of, takes its bearings from the problem of polarization and the culture wars as those relate to religion and politics. And, you know, the difficulty with polarization is that it sweeps us up and forces us to pick two sides which are pretty stark in their alternatives. And the question comes up for me, and as I know it does for many people, like, isn't there enough, do we have to have this fight? Both sides have something to say, and is there a way of crossing that line? And wrote the book because it seemed to me that Sargent Shriver is an example of providing another way in that particular conflict realm. What led me to the current book, the one we're going to talk about tonight, is I wanted to do it in finer lines of how he does that, how by infusing what he called spiritual values into secular affairs, you can transform things. But it also takes on the other kind of major conflict having to do with religion and politics in our country today, which is more of a abstract one. I mean, it's very concrete, but it's abstract in the sense that it's very difficult to think about religion and spirit in empirical terms. They seem to be a matter of opinion. They seem to be a matter of conviction, rather than concretely identifiable in our consciousness and in our world. And Sarge was a guy who was very astute discerner of spirits, and so this book is about that and how to do it, what he did, particularly in the public realm.
Yes, well, of course, I agree with your assessment of both books, having read both.
Kind of.
Yeah, and I guess this might be a good point. I mean, James gave a very nice overview of who Sarge was, but I'm wondering if you can add a little bit to that for viewers this evening.
He has an amazing resume as far as that goes. I mean, it didn't begin with the Peace Corps. He had very powerful work in Chicago before that.
Right.
He worked in civil rights and ran the Catholic. Well, he was chair of the board of the Catholic Interracial Council of Chicago, and desegregated the schools, the Catholic high schools in Chicago over the 50s, and that sort of primed him for his work at the Peace Corps. And then later he ran the war on poverty and worked in nuclear arms control. Did some powerful and groundbreaking work in religious dialogue in the Middle East. So he had quite a, and of course he was much better at those kinds of things, of being a public servant, than he was a an elected official, because he ran for vice president in 72 and got slaughtered, and then tried to become the presidential nominee of the Democratic Party in 76, and that didn't go past Iowa. So he was much better as a public servant than he was as an elected official, but
Yeah.
a wonderful man.
Yeah, we're gonna terrific, and his bio is just it's terribly impressive. It's just incredible when I read about him and we've just discussed him, and so I sort of prepped you for this next question, and because of my sort of obsession with identity, and all of the forms that takes, as we both know, bios talk a lot about accomplishments. And I'm going to ask
Right.
you to speak on his behalf of how do you think Sarge would have identified in terms of like what are the core values or core identities that he would describe himself with?
You prepped me for that, but it's still a difficult question to speak for Sarge in that way.
Yeah.
He would have been, I think he would, and I mean, you're right. Bio is one thing, and it's a set of accomplishments, and but he had all different kinds of roles. And I think of identity as kind of going with roles, because and so I think he would have thought of himself. I don't know if it's in this order, but he certainly would have thought of himself as a religious man, as a spiritual man. He
Yes.
went to mass. He went to mass he was a Catholic, and a Roman Catholic. He went to mass every day, and he said the rosary, and he was a third order Franciscan as a lay person, and was extraordinarily devout, and yet at the same time saw his religion as kind of providing the underpinning for his incredibly open-hearted internationalist view of people and race and things. So I think he would saw himself as a citizen of the world, and as a Catholic, embracing God's love for that world. He was also a family man. He loved his wife totally, loved his kids totally, and a devoted questioner. Every time I ever saw him, he's sort of like you. His questions are curious, his questions are penetrating, and so I would say he was spiritual. He was devoted to the people he cared about, and really concerned for other people in his world. And then had the good fortune, and I guess our country did too, that he had some incredibly influential roles in the public realm.
Yes, absolutely. Very, very gifted and very, gosh, it's funny. I think about his bio and I think about the description that you just gave, and it's just, he's such a full person. He had so much to offer. In many ways, I don't know if it's fair. I hear this phrase used quite often, but ahead of his time in many ways, in terms of maybe where we sit today. And we're going to get to that in our conversation today. And so what I'd like to do now is to delve into the call. And I want to talk a little bit with you. I want you to share about the title and its broad and specific meanings. And then maybe you could talk a little bit about the conceit of the book, like how you arrived at the method to share Sarge's broader message through the use of dialogue, ingenious dialogue between a fictionalized character and Sarge himself.
Well, the title comes. It does operate on several levels. The first level is in a certain sense, the call is about the call that Sarge received on January 21st, 1961, when President Kennedy, newly inaugurated President Kennedy, called him in Chicago and said, "Sarge, I want you to run the Peace Corps." And Sarge said, "I don't know anything about the Peace Corps. I don't think I want to do this." But he changed his mind and did it. And in a conversation that he and I had later on. When I asked him about that, I said, well, you didn't want to do it. Why did you? And he said he felt spiritually called to take on the role. So the call is, and I was kind of flummoxed by that, and intrigued by that, and asked him about it, and we had a conversation about it. So the book begins an extended conversation about how that could be so. How could you, over on a phone call, discern some sort of spiritual call to do this, to totally upend your life in Chicago and go back to DC, where you had planned not to stay.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also, I mean, we can talk about this as we get further into the conversation, but we can talk about the I don't know if I want to call it the pre-call, because again, his spiritual call encompasses his whole being in many, many ways. Wouldn't you agree?
Right.
Yeah,
I would agree.
So the pre-call that I'm speaking of is the work that led him to that fateful day that he received the actual phone call from his brother-in-law. And I'm talking about the work that he did in Chicago, and we can talk more about that as we get into it. But can you describe a little bit? And because I'm so enamored with the way that you had all this information. And again, I having read the previous book and learning about all that and about how he put together the Peace Corps and what it represented and whatnot, the way that you incorporated this information that he had, the spirituality that he embodied, the way that you tell that through his voice and someone else's voice. And can you explain that?
Well, yeah, the book is set up as a dialogue. It's a dialogue between Sarge and between a character that we call Didymus, but it's one of Sarge's favorite characters from Christian scriptures, the Gospel of John in particular, the Apostle Thomas, disciple Thomas, who is referred to, I don't think he should be, Sarge didn't think he should be, often referred to as Doubting Thomas. And the reason he's referred to as Doubting Thomas is because when after Jesus was crucified and rose, the disciples, he appeared to the disciples, but Thomas wasn't in the room, and they came running to him and said, Thomas, you won't believe it, we saw Jesus. And he said, yeah, you're right, I don't believe this. and I'm not going to believe it until I can put my hands in his wounds and see him face to face. And the writer of the Gospel of John didn't think that was particularly an appropriate way to go at his faith, but apparently Jesus didn't mind, because a few days later, or sometime later, he did appear to Thomas, and Sarge liked that character and liked that event because he too felt that there was an experiential character to the spiritual life, an empirical character to the spiritual life. And so when I set up the dialogue, I used Sarge as the main voice, and Didymus as the questioner, wanting to be very, very empirical, be very, very critical, be very, very curious about how it could possibly be so that the spirit would have been discernible in that phone call from President Kennedy and throughout Sarge's life.
Yeah, so let's be clear.
It becomes,
let's be clear though that this conversation didn't actually happen.
No,
but
this conversation didn't actually.
Right, but you have all of this great resource material and personal experience with Sarge that you were able to weave all of this together with this character Didymus to ask these questions.
And the reason I did, yes, it's the notes are voluminous, and I did not try to make up. I mean, I did in essence put words in Sarge's mouth. What I call it in the introduction is a true conversation that never happened. It's true because it represents what Sarge did say. I took as much as possible from his speeches and from conversations that I had with him, from other kind of research that I did. So it's true to him, and I cared about historicity of it. And that's part of it. I'm glad you found it a felicitous way to go. I mean, I appreciate that. Appreciate that very much. But the reason I chose that, there's a long tradition, of course, of dialogues. Plato started dialogues, but his were basically logical treatises where he had an idea that he either wanted to prove his opponents wrong, and he did. He made them out to be kind of dolts in key ways. And this isn't like that. This is an attempt to have a conversation in which Sarge leads Didymus into his own mind, and you need a conversation for that. That's what you do on your podcast, right? You want to know how somebody's thinking. You want to know why they made the choices they made. You want to know what they were thinking. And so it's not just what their opinion is. It's not just what they say, but it's how they're using their mind when they say those things, how their heart is orienting them when they say those things. So that over the course of the book, what I hope happens for the reader is they move from being in Didymus's position, my position earlier, which is how can this be so, to I get this is how that can be so, and I can recognize that in myself as well. So it's an empirical approach where the experiential focus is a combination of the sensory experience and conscious experience and spiritual experiencing, is the way Sarge understood them.
Yeah, and I mean, as a reader with a lot of curiosity, it reads like a real conversation, like a real dialogue between one. And there is, at no point did I feel like, oh wait, this didn't actually ever happen. It's just so engaging, and so it just pulls you in. And so with that in mind, I wanna, and we talked about this. I wanna start right off the bat with a quote from early on in the book, which to me sort of epitomizes Sarge and the work that he was trying to do. And he says, "For me, there could be no higher priority in Chicago, in the United States, or anywhere else in the world than to find practical answers to the number one question of the day. How can people of different religions, cultures, and races, white, black, yellow, and brown, come together in peace to advance the dignity and welfare of all?" So I don't know, I'm hoping other people feel the same way, but that just carries so much weight. Can you talk a little bit about this lifelong work that he was engaged in through that quote?
Well, you're right. It was a lifelong work. It marked everything he did, from his work in civil rights in Chicago through. That's what the Peace Corps was all about. That was his great experiment in international peace building. And then he brought it home in the war on poverty and no first strike policy for nuclear arms control. That what to talk about it for Sarge, I mean, you're absolutely right that it was his guiding motto. It was the intention that he wanted to fulfill with his life. And what I explore in the book is his conviction that could happen. And so, and what always drew me to him and to his work and to his speeches was that it was so much unlike Hobbes. It was so much unlike the political realism of the fact of the claim that what we're really living in this world is a war of all against all. And Sarge did not believe that. He believed that you could cross boundaries of race and culture and class and language and commit yourself to dignity and welfare of all, but that you needed to do that by orienting yourself to the spirit. And by spirit, he just meant the force of transcendental compassion and love that was pulling that operates in all of us. I'm not sure if that got at you.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I want to continue because you brought that up about the spiritual transformation, and you mentioned earlier you're talking about the conflict between spiritual values and secular affairs, and I want to also take a section from the book that I'm going to read. We've discussed this a little bit. So Sarge says, I've been using devotional language to talk to you about my phone call with the president. Of course, that's fine with me, and that's where your question carried my mind. But I know that talking this way has its risks communicatively. And Didymus says, what risks? And Sarge answers, the risk that people will leap to conclusions, false conclusions. Didymus says, what conclusions? Sarge responds that I am either being uncritical or doctrinaire, maybe both. Didymus says, I wasn't thinking about you that way. Sarge responds, not everybody would, of course. Didymus says, but some people perhaps, and that concerns you. And Sarge says, yes, it does. Didymus says, so help me to understand. As soon as these people hear your report that you felt spiritually called to lead the Peace Corps task force, you're worried they will leap to what conclusion? Sarge answers, the conclusion that I am not being realistic, that my spiritual convictions have led me to surrender the critical use of my mind, that by claiming I was consciously present to the spirit in my conversation with the president, I surrendered any claim I might have to be taken seriously as an evidence-based thinker. Didymus says, because... Sarge responds, because they are convinced that whatever happened during my phone call with the president, it is best understood in explicitly secular sensory terms, not in religious or spiritual terms. Didymus responds, but for you, it's not best understood that way. Sarge says no. Didymus says, and you're concerned that because you discuss your experience in devotional terms, people refuse to take you seriously. So again, I would love it if you could talk about this push-pull, this spiritual values versus secular affairs, and how Sarge, I guess, juggled both sides.
Well, the dilemma is deep in our culture, isn't it? I mean, there's a for the last 400 years, beginning with Galileo and the scientific revolution, we've shifted our primary way of knowing to thinking in empirical terms. I keep saying empirical, but that's exactly what I mean. That if something is true, there's some sort of evidence-based conclusion or there's some sort of that we can go to. I know in the political sphere these days, even that's come under fire. But basically, that's how we operate in the world. But it's been there's been a fight with that with science and religion for those same 400 years. And what Sarge was able to do, and so as he goes on to explain, is to differentiate several kinds of evidence. One kind which is basically scientific evidence. I mean, what we think of as scientific evidence is sensory-based evidence. It's what we see or hear or taste or touch with our senses. Sarge was well aware that there are also other experiential dimensions to life, one being conscious, that is what we talked about as, the use of our minds, the use of our hearts, the fact that we're awake and alert beings. And then a third one, he made clear to me, and he makes clear in speeches and elsewhere, is the realm of spiritual experiencing, which we experience as part of our consciousness. And so the reason that people tend to, the reason we're in the mess we are with the polarization over religion and politics is that we don't have spontaneously good ways or fluent ways of thinking about spiritual experience and integrating them in with our life. And the purpose of the book was to show how at least Sargent Shriver did it and give people an option to think about that. And so what he does over the course of the book with Didymus is lay out some key terms of that framework that he uses to think with. And Didymus takes him through different parts of his life to do that.
Yeah. I think I mentioned to you, I've been reading this book called On Dialogue by, I think his name is David Baum. And one of the things he talks about and that gets in the way of our ability to have dialogue is assumptions and opinions. It made me think a lot about Sarge's work in terms of mindfulness of going about trying to open up people's consciousness to having a greater ability to discuss difficult topics.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. He believed barriers rooted in personal, racial, cultural, and religious differences can be overcome with the help of spirit.
You're wondering about that. Yeah.
Yes, indeed, yes.
Well, the thing about those barriers and the thing that makes them so hard to resolve is that they are scary. They pose a threat. And when we experience ourselves as threatened by someone else's religious views, threatened by someone else's race, threatened by someone else's job, or whatever it is, we tend to just be focused on how to ameliorate that threat. We don't ask what's really going on for them. We don't ask who are they really? What did they mean? What's this threat narrative that I have going? Is it true? What's really at stake for me? And the blame tends to shift on the person that represents the threat rather than our own perception of what they're doing. So for Sarge, it was clear that's secularly and irredeemably, no, it is redeemably human way of going at conflict. And what we need to do is be called, brought, strengthened to stop and be curious, to stand and say, wow, I'm feeling threat here. I wonder what's really going on for me, for that person, and to ask questions. Because Sarge knew that the only way change happens is if people change their minds and hearts about how they're taking their stand on we can't change them. We can't force them to change. And the only way that's going to happen is if you get curious about what's going on for them. And Sarge was convinced through his own experience that that is a difficult enough task that it takes help. And that help comes in the form of the spirit calling people to be their best selves, calling people to transcend their own biases, their own limitations, their own lack of ability to be curious. So that's what's going on there.
Yeah. Yeah. And, well, you well know that makes me think about the work and the message that I carry about we have more in common than we have different, and
Right.
how it's so important to keep that the focus. And that resonates with me, what Sarge was doing there. So I wonder if we could talk about a little bit, I don't know if we want to do this, but talk about the parallels with Sarge's work and his writings and the current climate that we find ourselves in, the country, the world, society. And knowing what you know of Sarge, which is, this beautiful book, this beautiful dialogue, do you see or feel that the current climate could benefit from Sarge's sage advice? And in what ways could his international vision be transformed into a national program?
Well, the answer to the first question is yes, of course. I think that his example could help us. I think we need an American hero of these days in of Sarge's ilk, somebody who is who is a keen thinker, a problem solver, has a huge heart, and isn't afraid of difference, and is willing to be curious in the face of difference. It's totally disarming to be wondered about rather than hedged against. And to do that in such a way that doesn't make it that comes across that, so it doesn't seem that you're being a fool, that as the section, the part of the book that you read, that you've surrendered your claim to being an evidence-based serious thinker that you're just, Sarge was called a Boy Scout. He was called optimistic. He was not taken seriously in lots of cases when he was running things, except by the people who worked with him. And I mean, he was one of the most, during that period of time, during the 60s, he was on the cover of Life magazine. Time magazine twice. He was a very popular guy, and a well-known figure. And he did, to your last question, he did have an opportunity to try to make his vision work, make his international vision work domestically when he shifted from working in Peace Corps to running the war on poverty, where it was his task. He didn't get a chance to finish it, but it's still an ongoing thing, and he's laid the seeds for it to end poverty in our country too. So, and that is a task that calls for openness and creativity, and the Peace Institute is working on that project now. Adam Green is annotating Sarge's, the memoir that Sarge wrote about his 5-year period of running the war on poverty. So you can look forward to that coming out.
That's terrific. I want to add a quote to something you mentioned earlier about difference. Sarge says, "How can you face down your fear of another person if you have no genuine opportunity to understand the person you are afraid of?"
He was talking about the problem of having segregated schools at the time. That was his main critique, and he was scathing about the church being an institution that was segregating children by race, by ethnicity, just as part of the way of doing business at the time. So that's changed, and he had a lot to do with that. But he would also say that facing down the person that you're afraid of, or that takes, as we were talking, takes strength, takes the spirit, takes just, if it were easy to be compassionate in the face of difference, if it were easy to love your enemy, if it were easy to be curious about something you're damn certain is going to hurt you, there'd be a lot more of it. And I guess Sarge's hope, or my hope for the dialogue, is that it'll open people up to what's an opportunity for them right now. Because one of the things that Sarge was very clear on is that the flow of the Spirit is everywhere, no matter who you are, no matter where you are, no matter what religion you are, no matter whether you're secular or religious. The possibility of opening up to compassion and to curiosity is with us now, and always is. And that's what's so, to me, was amazing. He was extraordinarily devout and extraordinarily Catholic, and he prayed to Mary, but he was totally universal as well.
Yeah, so let's delve into a little bit of what you were talking about in terms of Chicago, and what he did to help the situation of the Catholic schools in Chicago. So I'm wondering if you can give us a little overview of Cardinal Mundelein, and perhaps a little snippet of the riots of 1919, and then the long-term effects of the Cardinal's decisions on the Catholic schools in Chicago, which led up to Sister Mary Frances and Sarge's experience with her.
Well, one of the things that Didymus gets Sarge to do in the book is to explain how he did what he did, what he was doing, and how he did what he did. And so there's a winding conversation, as conversations are about that. And one of the things that they talk about is because Sarge, when he was invited, he felt called to do this too. When he was invited to come on the board of the Catholic Interracial Council in Chicago, and to work on the problem of segregated schools. This was in 1953. It turned out that virtually all of the 73 high schools in Chicago were segregated by race. And he was appalled by that and astonished by that. And so they were exploring how in the world that could happen. And it just was it was the outcome of the way that the diocese had been creating churches for the last 100 years. They'd been doing it in terms of ethnic Catholicism. So there were Irish churches, and there were Polish churches, and there were Slavic churches, and and when the migration of Black and brown people into the city came, that it became natural to have Black churches and Mexican churches and so forth. And so each of those churches then built their own school, and you have an infrastructure that's segregated. And then the question comes, how do you change, and then, well, the question comes, how do you change that? But you asked about the race riots in 1919.
Yes, I wondered that. I don't know if that's I wanted to put it into context about sort of how that led to some of the damage that happened with the churches and whatnot, but the whole city of Chicago for that matter.
Yeah. Well, there were, right up, as you well know, and as I'm sure many, if not all of the listeners know, there was right after World War I, there was in a number of cities in the United States, there were violent clashes between whites and Blacks. There was it was part of Jim Crow, and it was part of it was a racist backlash. And probably the most famous one of it is the Tulsa massacre of 1921. But there was a big massacre. I mean, there was a big fighting in Chicago too for over the course of a week. Hundreds of people were injured on both sides, and there were white, particularly it was on the South Side, and particularly Irish Catholic men would get in cars and rove around looking for black people to harm, and the soldiers, the Black soldiers who'd come back from World War I, they'd return with their rifles. They would get into sniper nests, and they would try to pick off the people who came driving by marauding. It was quite serious for 4 or 5 days until the mayor finally called in the National Guard to repress things. But the way that you'd think, and this was what was troubling to Sarge, you would think that a race riot like that would lead to some sort of efforts to a reconciliation. But that isn't what Cardinal Mundelein did. He had the model, the narrative image, as I call it, that he had of how the different people the different Catholics ought to relate, was based on racial difference. And so he kind of doubled down on that strategy and built more white high schools and focused on developing Black Catholic churches on the South Side and in Bronzeville. And so by the time, Mundelein was Archbishop and then Cardinal of Chicago for 25 years, from 1915, when the Black immigration was starting, all the way through 1940 when he died. So Sarge was working 10 years after that, and went around and talked to principals of all the different schools, set up conditions for them to begin to integrate.
Yes, his call. He got the
His
call.
Yes, he got
exactly.
the call to do that, and he called on them to do it too.
Yes, exactly. And I have to say, here I sit in Chicago presently, and it's still probably one of the most segregated large cities in the country. Weirdly enough, I happen to live in one of the most integrated neighborhoods, in one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the city, but that's a rarity for this city. So we still need Sarge's work to spread out here a little bit more. So I guess, we're kind of running out of time here, but I wanted to sort of try to kind of, if we could wrap this up in any way. And what I want to ask you is, so that if you could talk a little bit about the end result of Sarge's work, both in Chicago, which you just explained to us, and with the Peace Corps, and thinking in terms of, so this was a quote that just really, again, there's so many quotes in here that just really came out and hit me so powerfully. And this one was designing sails that would capture the winds of the spirit. And if you could sort of tell us about the end result of all of this work that Sarge.
Well, the metaphor that Didymus and Sarge use throughout the book is the spirit as the wind in your sails, and sails, and it's the experience of your sails being full. And Didymus, of course, questions that because we don't have sails, and what in the world are you talking about? So Sarge, so what Sarge really means is that we have events that confront us, and we have our felt responses to those events, our valuing of those events, our discerning of those events. And we're either open to curiosity and compassion or we're not. And what increases the probabilities of our being open to those things has a lot to do with what our stories are, what our images are, what our narratives are. It's kind of like what you do in your play. You give people a new narrative image to think about race relations. So Peace Corps did the same thing. It gave people, I mean, both not only the host country nationals who received Peace Corps volunteers, but for the volunteers themselves. There was a set of rules that, as Sarge called them, that Peace Corps volunteers needed to do. They needed to go abroad and learn the language. They needed to anchor themselves in the customs. They needed to live in the economic standard of the people they were trying to serve, and they needed to go there and ask how they could be of help, not presume, not get involved in politics, not. And so if you have a job, a Peace Corps volunteer, and your goal is to make friends and build peace, and you have a model for that, which says anchor yourself in the community, open yourself, take on, be willing to suffer what it takes to suffer to do that. And that's the kind of sail that he built to capture the capacity for self-transcendence that people have abroad. But it doesn't have to be abroad. It can be here. It can be can and should be in our lives and in our relationships, our marriages.
Yes. I'm gonna throw one last quote, which I think is a nice place to wrap
Thanks.
up. Yeah.
I'll let you do that.
There's always a cloud of unknowing at the heart of the call. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, The Cloud of Unknowing is a reference to a spiritual classic, a mystical classic, a 14th century English anchorite. Wrote a book called The Cloud of Unknowing. Sarge was familiar with that work. But what it means is that if you do one of the reasons the process of being curious, the process of opening yourself to compassion, the process of questioning your own certainties is difficult, and why we need help is because if you really do that, you're letting go of control over the situation. You're really opening yourself to what that person has to say, really opening yourself to encountering and committing, and you don't know what. That's certainly what he did when he said, okay, I'll do this Peace Corps thing, or okay, I will help to desegregate these high schools. That's what we all have to do when we feel called to transcend ourselves. And you let go of the position of saying, well, I'm going to tell the story. I know how I want it to go. I know who the characters are. I know what the narrative ought to be. And instead, you begin to realize that that this cloud of unknowing is kind of a blessed thing, that if you don't know, you're in the right place, and that it's not a scary thing, and that you can lean into it and just keep asking, keep being curious. And that's the way Sarge was.
That is a perfect place to leave off. I'm going to ask James if we have any questions, but I think that was a really great button for the conversation.
Well, thank you for your questions. So thank you for the careful reading of the book. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
Indeed, and thanks to you both. And I'm so happy to see some wonderful questions that have come in from our audience. I'm excited for you to share your responses with them. I want to start with a few more definitional questions, and then we'll transition into some more practical ones. There were several folks interested in the term spirit, and specifically the phrasing of spiritual realism, taken off the subtitle of the book and referenced in the conversation. I wonder if you can put some context on spiritual realism as a term, and how Sarge would have viewed spirit, whether that's a capital S or lowercase s there, but how he understood that through his life and work.
Well, he would have understood spirit. It's done as a lowercase s in the book, and that's how I think that's how he understood it. Although when he would be talking devotionally, he might put a capital S on it and put holy in front of it, because he would use Christian language. But he was fully aware that that was just one of the ways of opening up to what was a broader reality. And spirit is, for Sarge, he was a pretty traditional theologian in the sense that he and kind of, for those who know about it, was well read in Aquinas and Aquinas' distinction between the natural and the supernatural. And by supernatural, he just meant something that absolutely transcends us, but that is related to us. So he was clear, and Didymus, and he talked about this a lot, where it's not as though the spirit enters into, and this gets back to Michael's last question to me too, it's not as though the spirit enters into our minds and gives us thoughts or tells us what to do. It's that it lifts us into being like the spirit, so that we get carried to transcend ourselves. So it's a reality. It's an experiential reality that lies at the heart of our consciousness. That's how he would see it. And the reason for realism, the reason for calling it spiritual realism, Sarge didn't specifically use that term. I used the term for him because of his realistic approach to spirit, meaning the empirical approach that he took. And and also as a counterpoint to the political realism of Hobbes. So that's why realism is in the title, because it is realistic. If by real you mean you have hypotheses and you're willing to back them up with experiential data. And so there's sensory experiencing for him, there's conscious experiencing, and there's spiritual experiencing, and those are discernible if you pay attention. And he had ways of paying attention, and that's what the book tries to spell out.
We got a few questions specific to that notion of understanding self-transcendence beyond the concept and into the pragmatic. I wonder maybe if you could give us an example of how he accessed that, his mechanisms for accessing spirit.
Mechanism for accessing spirit. Excuse me. He prayed every day. He went to mass every day. He cultivated, he didn't call it mindfulness, but I think it's fair to say that he cultivated a spiritual mindfulness mindfulness of himself, his mindfulness in the smaller sense of just being aware of what his mind was doing at every moment, and then being aware within that of when he was feeling tugged toward transcendence. So in the call from, I mean, one of the things he told me in the conversation, and I replicated in the book, was that when he received the call from President Kennedy asking him to run the Peace Corps task force, he was both aware of what his mind was doing, saying, no, I don't really want to do this, and also aware that he was feeling a tug to transcend himself, a tug to say yes, a tug that he should do this. And I think Sargent's view was that we've all experienced that kind of thing. There's a sense when you're leaning into what you really care about, when you get an inner discernment of a tug or a pull or an elevation toward what's better, what's truer for you, what's good. And he was very astute about that, but that's the way he practiced it. And he had and what I sketch out in the book, he had a model for thinking about it and identifying it politically and being able to work with it. But that would take another hour conversation to lay out that model.
I get the sense we could speak for several hours. I wonder if we look at the current landscape in politics in the United States, I wonder if there are any figures that emerge to you as channeling or sharing values and perspectives with Sarge. The asker of this question had a specific name, wondering if you can speak to Tim Kaine, who is the VP candidate for Hillary Clinton. But the question, I think, stands: if we're sitting here inspired and wanting for more Sarge in our modern lives, is there someone we can look to that emerges to you as someone who's walking that walk?
That's interesting. Michael, what do you think?
I really I don't have a clue, to be honest with you. I wish I did. I mean, I think the question is incredibly valid and important, because we look to people like we did to Sarge, or some people did to Sarge, for I'm going to use spiritual leadership, and that person might be the pastor in your church, or but I don't know if it's fair to look to our politicians for this kind of thing. I know that Sarge was in politics, and we discussed in previous conversations about spiritualizing politics without politicizing religion, but I don't know that there's a figure currently that I would. You agree, disagree, Jamie?
I don't know if there is a figure who exemplifies it, and I can't remember Tim Kaine's positions that well, so I can't comment on Tim Kaine. I'd love to have a conversation with whoever wrote that question. But, I think Sarge would say, it's not as though the spirit is hiding away. The spirit is there, available to everybody, and that there are that our politicians, that there are acts of heroism and there are acts of self-transcendence, despite what we see, despite what we hear, that are going on all the time, every day. And that if you were to sit down with, you would sit down with anybody virtually, you could find that, and you could have a conversation with them in which they would hone in on it for themselves. And I think Sarge would say that's what we need to do, that it's difficult to, we don't have the language for it. We don't have the discernment skills that we need, and we don't have the spiritual realism spread as broadly in the culture as it should be to do that. But I would say there's plenty of heroism and there's plenty of self-transcendence on both sides of the aisle, and at every level of government. I don't know that anybody has come out with a policy that is the equivalent of Sarge's. I don't
Right.
that so if that's what we're looking for, I don't know about that. But as far as the people themselves, I have no doubt the spirit is blowing there and they're catching their sails.
I'm watching the clock. Hopefully everyone will indulge us for just a couple more. We've got, I'm so proud of our audience. I really appreciate how thoughtful everyone is.
And
Thank
I
you
wish I
for all
could
of
see
your
them.
questions. So I want to share another one that I think is applicable to both of you in your journeys and also through the lens of Sarge, specifically into the world of conflict resolution. If we take empathy as a foundation, so if we assume empathy and we find ourselves in a conflict that that empathy doesn't seem to be able to bridge on its own, are there methodologies, are there techniques, are there things you can offer our audience? I don't think this question was about the Thanksgiving table, but imagine good neighborliness, and I wonder if you can offer some kind of practical suggestions for our audience.
Well, I would, so I have a toolkit that I use that I have wrote a book about. Nobody wants to talk about it: race, identity, the difficulties in forging meaningful conversations. And the tools, the 7 tools, are things that I came up with over the years of trying to engage people in conversations about race and identity, which are very awkward and cumbersome and uncomfortable conversations. And, you know, over the 20 plus years I've been doing this, I came upon these tools. And some of those tools are, you know, Jamie and I have had this conversation numerous times. You know, the first tool is tell your story. Because, you know, in our stories, we discover our commonalities. And now I realize that has a bit of an empathy factor into it, but we find by finding commonalities, then suddenly you find something that you know, you relate to as someone in some way. And then the second tool is don't judge the differences, which we automatically do. I think we're, you know, maybe we're hardwired to do that. And then the tools go on from there, whether it's, we have to recognize that there isn't one way to have a conversation about race and identity. If there was one way to do it, we'd all be doing it. That would make it a lot easier. We need to get comfortable being uncomfortable. I know people have heard that term many times and maybe they poo-poo it, but it's absolutely, look, we get uncomfortable every day in our lives. Something happens to us and we're uncomfortable. We can get through that. And a really important tool, I think, that we have lost, and again, I'm going to refer to Jamie on this, we've talked about this numerous times, is we can disagree so long as we're not disagreeable. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that one, Jamie, because again, we've had conversation about that, and I think Sarge's work is the epitome of that.
Yeah, I think those are great rules. Of course, to tell your story, you need to have somebody who's curious about your story. So you might, the prequel or the to that would be curious about other people's story. Ask them. I mean, so if you see, I mean, and the empathy, that's, I think, how empathy gets actualized. But if you, and we all do, if you see somebody has a strong reaction to something, I mean, maybe they're hiding it, maybe you just see it in a scowl, maybe it's, you know, some other way, or they slam a cabinet. I'm thinking of the Thanksgiving dinner kind of scenarios rather than other ones. And you ask, with Michael's questions in mind, or Michael's rules in mind, what's going on there? It seems like you're upset. It seems like you're angry. It seems like you're perturbed. And what you'll typically get is somebody's surprised that you care about that enough, and they will probably tell you the story behind that, as long as you keep asking and don't think you automatically understand without follow-up questions, and then don't get upset with the people who say nothing. I don't, you know, nothing's wrong. or they don't even know what's wrong. They're just slamming around, and it's so compact that they can't put words to it. And as a matter of fact, your asking is an embarrassment. So, and don't feel bad about that. So it's just, kind of get in the work, be curious, be willing to feel, as Michael said. Sarge said, be willing to suffer, but that was probably a religious term he was using. And Michael's right, be willing to feel uncomfortable and to be wrong.
Yeah, I would put that in the last tool that I use, I think is so important in this equation is practice forgiveness. It's been described as the most difficult work that you will ever do, but also the most rewarding.
And that's hard to do for oneself too.
Yeah, exactly.
And others.
Exactly.
Jamie, there was something you said that I wrote down. It really caught me, which was, it's totally disarming to be wondered about rather than hedged against. And I wanted to bring that back up for our audience. That was really wonderfully said. There are other amazing questions. I'm mindful of the time and what we're asking of our audience. This last question, I think, offers an opportunity for some closing thoughts that might wrap us in hope and inspiration as we head into tomorrow. The question is, wondering if you can speak to the link between spirit and courage.
Sure. I mean, there's definitely, to the degree, I mean, we're thinking that I've been talking about spirit as we experience it, not, as the tug towards self-transcendence, as the elevation toward being our best selves. Then courage is one of those, I think it's one of those feelings that you have, or one of those an impetus that we have that takes us beyond what might be the cost of what we're doing, might be the pain involved in what we're doing. I think of courage that way, as facing into difficulty and being willing to transcend it. I mean, we can talk about courage as, a human thing strictly within our capacities, but I think if we get curious about those moments and you begin to wonder about them, the experience of spirit will be there for the person. They'll be able to name it.
I think that's great, Jamie. I guess my first inclination in thinking about the question, James, is that I think so many people perceive the words differently. In other words, we all hear a word and we go through our minds and think about how we would define that. And so spirit to me might be different to Jamie, to you, to any number of our participants this evening. And the same with courage. And courage could be something heroic that people think of, or it could be just something small that someone did that took courage to do it. And I guess my answer to the question would have something to do with, for me, what it is, and it's a daily thing, because I guess I don't want to say I struggle with it, but I'm a meditator. I meditate twice a day. And it takes courage for me to do that, actually. I mean, it's a daily practice, but I have to sit down and do it. And then in doing it, I receive spirit. I'm quiet and I am receiving spirit. And so I guess that's how I would answer that.
And then we want to talk about the relationship between fortitude and courage.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, James.
I think that's wonderful ground to stand on. And I wonder if you can offer closing thoughts, and then I'll wrap us up.
Jamie? Closing thoughts? Well, my closing thoughts would be just the gratitude for the conversation, Michael. It's disarming to speak with you. You're very open and spirit-filled, and compassionate and smart. And so it was just a delight to be here. And James, the opportunity to be part of the Vail Symposium has been a real treat. So I just thank you and everybody else who's out there listening. Thanks.
Yeah, see, this is it. This is well, because he's so present. You're so in the moment, and you're so present, and you're so I mean, thank you. Is like this has been if you can't tell, I hope you can tell. Jamie and I really enjoy speaking to one another about a wide variety of topics, especially about Sargent Shriver and spirit. But thank you, James, for the opportunity for us to have another great conversation with one another. I mean, it's just terrific. So.
Well, certainly on behalf of our small but mighty staff and our board, thanks to you both for giving of your time and your talent, your wisdom, your insights to our community. And thanks to our community, I would have loved to observe this conversation myself, but it's made all the more special by you attending and by you pursuing your curiosity with us. So thanks to everyone, and I would implore us all, please stay curious and stay mindful. And Jamie, Michael, have a wonderful evening.